So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. We will conclude the reading of Charles Dickens's Great Expectations with this session. So just to sum up very quickly what we've done so far in the last couple of sessions, we looked at the power of remote capital, the whole idea of capital operating remotely from elsewhere, which obviously complicates the entire paradigm of center and margin, because you have Magwitch, who is technically a convict operating from New South Wales, Australia. And from there, he's remotely controlling the capital in terms of building or buying a gentleman in London, right? So we saw how in the last session that the whole masculinity of Pip, the construct of masculinity that he is pushed to becoming, is actually bought rather than made. So he is essentially purchased by Magwitch, who funds him from elsewhere. So the flow of capital, which can operate through proxy, which can operate through remote service, which can operate through different kinds of newly formalized institutions, is obviously a very important part in the story, in the entire narrative. And it's really interesting to see how we spoke about this in the last session, how the whole idea of space and time, how space and time get compressed, decelerated, expanded, accelerated, depending on different situational conditions, situational coordinates. So, for example, the countryside is a different kind of space, it's more expansive, it's a different kind of time, where there's more time, more decelerated, there's more leisure in the countryside. Whereas the city of London is a sort of monstrous metropolis where everything operates through kinesis and contagion. And we spoke about how there seems to be a very interesting parallel to be made, a comparison and contrast to be made between Charles Dickens's Great Expectations and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Again, the whole fear of contagion, the fear of unchecked capital, the flow of unchecked capital, and how capital can operate through proxy, how capital can operate remotely from the outside. So in Dracula, for instance, the Count is an exotic outsider, and yet he has a power of capital to create a lot of changes or intervene in the inside of England. So we see that happening similarly with Magwitch as well. So Magwitch is this exiled convict. At the same time, he also has an agency. He acquires the agency through accident, through procurement of capital, through which he can remotely control the capital from the outside, right? Now, in this session, which is the final session on Dickens's novel, we'll look at the ending of Great Expectation, as it were. It has sort of two different endings, if you know the history of the book. So Dickens wrote one ending in terms of bringing Pip back into Satis House, the countryside, whereas the published ending, it says Pip goes away somewhere else, in a dark underbelly, in a darker underbelly of the capital. He's making money, working for a company, and he's just plummeting into this sort of carnivorous, cannibalistic world of unchecked capitalism. So essentially, it's a death plunge that Pip has in the end. But we look at how, despite the differences in the two endings, there is some similarity as well in terms of how the whole aspirational masculinity, which is embodied by Pip, which is closely corresponding with the social, political, discursive, cultural changes, get played out. All this, the entire economy of aspirations and expectations gets played out. And again, we talked about how the very ontology of expectation in the novel, it has a psychological element to it, as you're expecting something, but at the same time, it is also related to the whole idea of the banker's investment, right? You invest something with the expectation of greatness, a great expectation. I mean, you can sort of bring it to a very interesting and superficial banking vocabulary in terms of looking at the expectation of return. So I'm investing into a future with the expectation of return. So that is also a very interesting subplot in the novel. And it is no accident that there is so many references to the bank, there's so many references to money, to finance, and new forms of financial institutions, and also how we read this with some details in the last couple of sessions, the whole idea of monstrosity, which appears to emerge through this unchecked flow of capital, unchecked flow of money through different kinds of proxy, different kinds of spectral coordinates. So we come to the end of the novel, which is also the end of the essay. and this should be on your screen. The return to Satis house and Pip's potential union with Estella of the published ending allow Pip to travel backwards and to redeem some of the losses of his youth. So as I mentioned, Dickens wrote two endings. One was the one that didn't really get published, where he doesn't make Pip return to Satis house. He pushes Pip elsewhere, but at the same time, we can see how there's a comparison and contrast to be made. But the published ending is a little bit sentimental. The published ending is a little bit, it carries some sense of redemption, although if you read closely, there's actually no redemption, but there is some superfluous, superficial, structure of redemption. It allows him to travel backwards, recover time, recover space, right? So going back to the countryside, going back to Satis house, in a way, becomes a sort of symbolic attempt to reclaim the lost time, reclaim the prelapsarian space-time. And we talked about the biblical connotations as well, in terms of how the plot gets played out. Dickens's original ending, bleaker and more provisional than the one he rewrote on Bulwer-Lytton's advice. Bulwer-Lytton was the advisory body in the publishing house, places Pip in London again. So this is the ending I was talking about, how the original ending of Great Expectations, the one that didn't get published eventually, although there are some manuscripts, and if you do some serious research in Great Expectations, you find the Dickens manuscript contains this ending where Pip is in London and he's sort of plummeting into this dark world of the capital. So the one that he wrote originally places Pip in London again, walking along Piccadilly with little Pip. Right. So the whole idea of bringing the two Pips together, walking down Piccadilly, is very interesting, because what that ending potentially showed is that the adult Pip is carrying on his descent into hell, whereas the older Pip comes back to walk beside him. So there is this biblical thing about walking, the guardian angel walking beside the flawed man. But at the same time, there is this Dantesque quality to it as well. So there's this whole idea of inferno getting played out. Pip is walking into London again, and this is the inferno that Dickens is trying to dramatize with some degree. Pip is clearly still divided from his old life. He and Estella merely looked sadly enough on one another. So there's no clear indication that Pip and Estella reunite. They look at each other, they happen to meet, but there is no clarity in the plot in terms of whether they come together, whether they find companionship with each other. They just look at each other. That's where the novel ends. And the present exerts no curative power over the past, right? So despite the two different endings, so I talked about how eventually the one that got published, it seems to offer a more sentimental ending. It seems to offer some kind of redemption, but there is no curative quality to it. So it's not like Dickens is saying, well, Pip's gone back to his old countryside and everything is nice and hunky-dory again. It's definitely not the case, right? So there is a damage which is already done. There is a brokenness that he carries with him all the time. So no amount of going back to his original landscape, no amount of attempting to recover old time can actually cure the damage done to Pip mentally, psychologically, as well as socially. In both endings, though, Pip lives in exile, working abroad in the East for Clarriker and Co. So this is what I meant. So Pip, despite the ending that Dickens eventually published, the published ending also tells us that Pip is actually plummeting into the dark underbelly of the capital, is working for some company called Clarriker and Co. in the East, right? So there's sort of mysterious quality about the ending as well. It doesn't really define or doesn't really tell us with any degree of clear information where exactly is the company located, right? And he's working as a partner in the house, so obviously he's got some position there, which is presumably making him some money. Although I must not leave it to be supposed that we were ever a great house, or that we made mints of money. So there is also this idea of, the exhaustion of capital, the exhaustion of the capitalist. So it's not like he's making a lot of money. It's not like he's a billionaire. He is working very hard for a company in the East as a partner, but there's no amount of succor which comes with enormous amount of wealth. So that is definitely not the case. We were not in a grand way of business, but we had a good name and worked for our profits and did very well. So it's not anything grand, it's not anything colossal, but they just made enough money and they made a respectable margin of profit. We worked for a profit and we did very well. So it was a profit-making company, but it is not really a grand company of multinational scales. That is not definitely the case over here. So, but he's found a footing, as it were. He's a partner. He has some position in the house, in the company house, and he is working in a company which makes reasonable amount of money, right? And that reasonable bit is important. So he's very much a run-of-the-mill capitalist, really. He's not really a grand capitalist. He's not really the Great Gatsby figure, and we talked about Great Gatsby in earlier class as well. So he's just a bit of an also-ran, if you know the phrase, an also-ran. So he's one of the many small, mid-sized capitalists working in the East, quote-unquote East. So Pip works for his profits, deliberately eschewing superfluity or excess. Having released the monster of capitalism in his text, Dickens now seems anxious to control and circumscribe its power, right? So there again, we come back to the idea of monstrosity, and there is a reading to be done which says that, well, having unleashed the effects of monstrosity, having unleashed the effects of unchecked capital with endless energy, excessive force, excessive vigor, there seems to be some kind of an anxiety on the part of the writer to give you a picture of controlled capital, to give you a picture of capital which is not excessive in quality, not really path breaking, not really boundary breaking. So a capital which is working under certain limits, under certain rules and perimeters, right? And that sense of boundedness is important over here, because there's a clear indication in the novel that Pip is working for a company which is making marginal profits, enough to get by, but nothing excessive, nothing ornate, nothing outside the ordinary, nothing extraordinary or excessive in quality. So there is that checked capital, which seems to be the situation over here. There's a sense of, well, there is capital, there is money to be made, there's a company that Pip is working in the East. He has a partnership in the house, but it is not really the Dracula kind of money. It is not really the Magwitch kind of money. So there seems to be some kind of an ending that Dickens is offering, where Pip is doomed, yes, because he doesn't come back to the pre-lapsarian past, he doesn't come back to the agrarian past, he doesn't come back to the Joe kind of labor, where there is just the stillness and solidity of a fixed place. He is in the sort of fluid, infinite flux of the capitalist engine, but the amount of money that he's making is not something excessive, it's not something embarrassingly big, right? So there is some degree of anxiety to rein in, as it were, the flow of the capital as embodied by Pip. So Great Expectations is a novel which, as Kate Flint has put it, calls into question how one may understand the processes of history themselves, right? So the mechanisms of history, the processes of history. So how does one sort of look at, examine, and calibrate the processes of history through which identities are made, unmade, and remade? Now we see that a lot of identities made, unmade, remade in this particular novel. And of course, all these are happening because different forces of history, different forces of social formation are at play. Sometimes undercutting each other, sometimes complementing each other, sometimes supplementing each other, sometimes, obviously attacking each other. This entire complex ecosystem of social, cultural forces is what is making and unmaking and remaking identities, especially the masculine identities in this novel, right? So there is a meta quality in Great Expectations as well, in the sense that a novel allows us a glimpse and insight, an interpretative insight, through which we can see the forces of culture, the forces of social formation at play. So, but the interesting thing is, of course, the expectation bit, and that's something which we must remind ourselves of. So, yes, we understand the process of history, how those get played, and the extent to which it is possible to play an active part in the shaping of one's own or society's future. So there is the idea of, how does one understand the role that an individual or some social forces can play in shaping the future. So there is an expectation bit, right? So the anticipation, the investment, the expectations, so how do those things get played out in terms of the futuristic investment, the futuristic quality of these forces, right? And in this, Great Expectations resembles the earlier Little Dorrit. Dickens, in his later work, is concerned to figure the ways in which the subjectivity is constantly distorted by an aggressive and divisive modern culture. So the aggressive, cannibalistic, divisive quality of modern culture, how does it attack subjectivity? How does that shape? So almost an assault in subjectivity. Because if you look at Pip, the way he is derooted from his countryside and sort of brought into London, and again in London he gets a sense of shame in finding out that the real investor into his individuality or gentlemanliness is someone from a criminal background. So again, there's a sense of derooting happening over there as well. So there is this constant bombardment, which can sometimes become an assault on a stable sense of the subject, a stable sense of subjectivity, right? So the stability of the subject is assaulted in Great Expectations. So different kinds of social, cultural, political, and financial forces at play. So Pip's engagement in such a society forces him, paradoxically, into a passive role in Great Expectations. Again, passivity seems to be the biggest trait in subjectivity over here, because he's just a numbed consumer, constantly bombarded, constantly assaulted, constantly attacked by the different forces of finance, different forces of culture. So that creates a sense of passivity in Great Expectations. The struggle and conflict of the late work is a struggle and conflict of the self-seeking expression in history, which, as Edward Said has said, is both more inclusive and more dynamic than ever before. So this is the really interesting thing about capitalism. And as Edward Said mentions it, at some level, capitalism is the most inclusive format. It is accommodative. It can take everyone into account. Whoever has a merit, whoever has the innovation is invited to contribute to the ecosystem. At the same time, it is also governed by dynamism. It never stops for anyone. It never stops for any individual, any organization. It keeps moving forward. So this progressive, dynamic quality of capitalism is also what creates the assault on the subject, right? So there is the absorption of the subject, the meritorious, hardworking, laborious, innovative subject is, absorbed into the capital, the flow of the capital, and the same flow of the capital then assaults the subject through its dynamic forces at play. So there is that constant pull going on over here. Ultimately, the monster of capitalism engulfs both Magwitch and Pip, both inventor and invented. So both the producer and the product, they are engulfed and absorbed by the monstrosity of capital, making the maintenance of a stable individual identity a perilous project in a world of endlessly transferable value. But value is not stable. Value is endlessly plastic, endlessly transferable. And this endlessly transferable quality of value obviously takes away the stability of the subject. So the subject becomes the vanishing subject, the unstable subject, the insecure subject. So among other things, Great Expectations is also a story about the interplay of investment and insecurity, right? So the moment investment comes into being, there's a seeking of security that comes. But again, like any form of investment, which is futuristic in quality, anticipatory in quality, there is always a sense of insecurity, always a possibility of precarity, right? So even if you use a very banking metaphor, money metaphor, any investment that we see also carries a possibility of no return, a possibility of a catastrophic crisis, right? A plummet, a crash. Again, the vocabulary is very violent, as you know. So any form of investment carries the interplay of possibility and precarity, of building and as well as peril, right? So this constant idea of the peril, the constant spectral quality of the peril, is obviously a big part in Great Expectations, which is why both the inventor and the invented, both the possibility and the peril are enmeshed together, entangled together in very asymmetric ways. So among other things, Great Expectations is a novel about change. It's a novel where change happens both psychologically as well as socially. And it is one of the most important novels in my mind to study the relationship between literature and change, between literature, fiction, novel, and different forms of social, political, cultural, and financial changes, right? And how those external conditions, this external ecology of change, shape and reshape the core subjectivity of the human subject, of the living, feeling, embodied subject, right? So embodiment, lived reality, the affective understanding of reality, all this began to change and get reconfigured with the very dynamic forces of capitalism which are at work. So with that, we end the reading of Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. I hope to have offered you some idea in terms of how the novel can be situated, or should be situated, in terms of how it connects to the broader social, cultural, financial changes happening around that time, and how those changes affect and reconfigure the very abstract notions, the otherwise abstract notions of individuality, agency, masculinity, etc. Right? So with this, we move on to the next novel that we studied together with Great Expectations, which is Heart of Darkness. I may have mentioned already, but we'll see also how there's a very dialogic relationship between Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness and Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, and how Frankenstein, the spectral presence of Frankenstein, keeps getting invested into almost all readings of these two novels. We saw in Great Expectations how there are many references, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect allusions to Frankenstein. And we also see how the same gets played out in different interpretative strategies that we use to read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which will begin in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.